The moment Florence Wells found the deed, her hand stopped shaking long enough for her to read her own name written in ink that had not yet fully dried. And in that single breathless instant, every question she had been carrying for 6 months dissolved into something she did not have a word for yet. She had arrived in Abilene, Kansas in the spring of 1872 with a carpet bag containing 2 dresses, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, and exactly $14.60 to her name. The journey west from Cincinnati had taken 11 days by rail and another 3 by wagon, and by the time the driver dropped her at the edge of town, Florence was so dust-covered and bone-tired that she nearly turned around and asked him to take her straight back east. She did not, because there was nothing left for her in Cincinnati. Her father had passed the previous winter from a fever that swept through the boarding house district where they lived, and the small inheritance she might have expected had been consumed entirely by his debts. Florence was 24 years old, possessed of a schoolteacher's education and a seamstress's hands, and she needed work. Abilene in 1872 was a town that smelled of cattle and ambition in roughly equal measure. The Longhorn Trail brought thousands of longhorns through its streets every season, and with the cattle came cowboys, drovers, merchants, gamblers, and every variety of person who understood that money moved fastest where animals moved thickest. Florence had read an advertisement in the Cincinnati Gazette about a position teaching at a newly established school at the edge of Dickinson County. The advertisement had been placed by a man named Harlan Greer, who served on the small school board as its treasurer. She had written him a letter. He had written back with an offer of $30 a month and lodging arranged through the town, and she had packed her bag and come. What the advertisement had not mentioned was that the lodging arrangements were considerably less settled than Harlan Greer's letter had implied. Florence discovered this within her first hour in Abilene, when she presented herself at the office of Greer's dry goods store and was told by his wife, a narrow-eyed woman named Edith, that the family they had expected to board Florence had moved on to Colorado 2 weeks prior. The school board was sorry for the inconvenience. They were looking into alternatives. In the meantime, perhaps Florence could find a room at the Drover's Inn. The Drover's Inn was not the sort of establishment where a schoolteacher boarded, and Florence knew it the moment she pushed open its door and found 3 cowboys playing cards at a table near the window, 2 of them already loud with whiskey at 2 in the afternoon. She backed out quietly, stood in the middle of Abilene's main street with her carpet bag, and tried to think. It was then that she heard the voice behind her. "You look like a woman who just found out her hotel is not a hotel." Florence turned. The man standing a few feet away was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a touch older, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind to something that was not quite handsome in the conventional sense, but was arrestingly, undeniably present. He wore a working man's clothes, not a trail cowboy's, but the clothes of someone who worked land rather than moved cattle. His hat was brown with a dark sweat ring at the crown. He was holding a coil of fence wire in one hand, and looking at her with an expression that was amused but not unkind. "The Drover's is not a proper establishment for a woman alone," Florence said, because that was the most dignified response she could manage. "No," the man agreed, and there was no satisfaction in it, only matter-of-fact agreement. "It is not. Where were you expecting to lodge?" Florence explained her situation in the abbreviated, dignified manner of someone who has not yet decided whether a stranger deserves the full version of their trouble. The man listened without interrupting, which she noticed, because most men interrupted within the first 2 sentences. "Widow Alderman takes in boarders," he said when she finished. "Her place is 3 blocks east, on the corner with the blue shutter. She is a decent woman and keeps a clean house. Tell her John Crawford sent you." Florence thanked him. He touched the brim of his hat and walked on, and Florence stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary, watching him move down the street with the particular ease of a man completely at home in his own skin. Then she picked up her carpet bag and walked east toward the blue shutter. Widow Alderman did indeed take in boarders, and she was indeed a decent woman, and the room she offered Florence was small but spotlessly clean, with a window that looked out over a kitchen garden that smelled of lavender and sage in the evenings. Florence paid a week in advance, unpacked her 2 dresses, set her mother's Bible on the windowsill, and breathed for what felt like the first time in weeks. She started at the schoolhouse the following Monday. It was a single-room building at the edge of town, recently constructed but already in need of a coat of paint, with 12 children ranging in age from 6 to 14. 3 of the older boys had clearly decided before she arrived that they intended to make her life difficult, which was not an unusual beginning. Florence had grown up watching her own father, a man of considerable learning and considerable ineffectiveness, and she had decided early that authority was a thing you claimed before anyone thought to challenge it. She walked into that schoolhouse at 8 in the morning, arranged her materials on the desk, and when the boys in the back row began to whisper, she called them by name, which she had memorized from the enrollment list the night before, and assigned them the longest reading passage in the primer without raising her voice once. By the 3rd week, she had a routine. By the 5th week, she had something approaching respect from most of the children and something approaching peace with the remaining holdouts. She walked to school every morning past the dry goods store, past the farrier's yard, and past the wide lot at the edge of the commercial district where a new structure was slowly going up, post by post and plank by plank, in the methodical way of a man who is building something to last rather than to impress. She noticed John Crawford more often than she expected to. He was not a man who sought attention, which made it stranger that she kept noticing him. He was simply there, in the way that solid things were there, present and reliable in a landscape full of things that changed daily. He ran a ranch called the Crawford property about 4 miles outside Abilene. She learned from Widow Alderman, who knew everything about everyone and shared it all with the particular generosity of a woman who considers information a form of hospitality. He had been in Dickinson County for 3 years, having come west from Missouri after the war. He kept cattle but also grew wheat on a portion of his acreage, which made him somewhat unusual among the cattlemen who regarded farming with the vague suspicion of men who had chosen their own path and were uncertain about those who chose differently. He had built his house himself. He had no family in the area. He came to town every Thursday for supplies, and occasionally on a Saturday if there was a meeting of the county association. Florence told herself she noted these facts only because she was new to the area, and it was sensible to understand who the significant people were in a community. She taught children. She knew their parents. John Crawford was the sort of man whose name came up in conversations, and so she had filed him away in her mind the way she filed away all useful information about Abilene. She did not think about the way he had looked at her on that first afternoon in the middle of the street, with that expression that was amused but not unkind. She did not think about it at all, or she told herself she did not, which amounted to the same thing until it didn't. Their second real conversation happened in October, during the harvest social that the town held every year in the lot behind the Methodist church. Florence attended because Widow Alderman insisted, and because it was expected that the schoolteacher be present at community events. She wore her better dress, which was a deep green wool that her mother had helped her make 3 years before, and she pinned her dark hair up and felt, for the first time since arriving, something that resembled comfort in a social setting. John Crawford was there. He was not the sort of man who danced. She could tell that immediately, though he was not the sort of man who stood sourly in corners either. He occupied the space he was in with the same unhurried ease she had noticed before, talking to a group of ranchers near the cider table, listening more than speaking. She noticed that, when he did speak, the other men leaned in slightly, which was a thing you observed about a person if you were paying attention. She was not intending to speak to him, but he crossed the yard toward the food tables at the same moment she did, and the geography of it simply made conversation the natural outcome. "Miss Wells," he said with a small nod, "how are the children?" "Obstinate and entirely wonderful," Florence said, and was surprised to hear the warmth in her own voice. "I have one boy who cannot spell to save his life but draws the most extraordinary pictures in the margins of his slate. I keep trying to work out how to teach both skills without making him feel that one is less valuable than the other." John Crawford looked at her steadily. "What is his name?" "Thomas Whitfield. His father is the farrier." "I know Thomas," he said. "He drew a picture of my horse once on the fence post outside the smithy. Got the animal exactly right down to the way she favors her left foreleg. I asked him how long it had taken him, and he said he did not know because he had not been thinking about it, he had just been looking." Florence felt something ease inside her chest. "That is exactly it. That is exactly the thing I am trying to preserve in him." "You are not likely to succeed if you are also trying to make him a speller," John Crawford said, and she thought he was being discouraging until she saw the faint pull at the corner of his mouth and understood it was a different kind of observation entirely. Children who see that way tend to keep seeing that way regardless of what a schoolteacher does about spelling. "You might just let him be excellent at one thing." "I refuse to accept that a person can only be excellent at one thing," Florence said. "That is an admirable refusal," he said. "I hope Thomas is equal to it." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, because it was genuine, not the polished social laugh she had learned to produce in Cincinnati drawing rooms, but the real kind that came from somewhere lower in her chest. John Crawford looked at her when she laughed, not with surprise but with something more deliberate, and then he looked away at the tables and asked her if she had tried the apple cake, which Widow Alderman had made and which was, he assured her, one of the most worthwhile things Abilene had to offer. They stood at those tables and talked for an hour. Florence did not fully register how much time had passed until she noticed that the lanterns had been lit, and the sky had gone from orange to deep blue above the church steeple. They talked about Thomas Whitfield's drawings, and then about the school board's plans for expanding the schoolhouse. And then, because Florence made a comment about the particular quality of the light over the Kansas plains that she had never seen anywhere before, about whether she had expected to find the West beautiful. "I expected to find it functional," she said honestly. "I came because there was work. I did not come expecting the sky to be that color." "What color?" "That particular shade at dusk where it is neither blue nor purple but both. We do not have that in Cincinnati. Our sky tends to orange at the edges and then just dark." John Crawford looked up at the sky as though he was seeing it for the first time with the benefit of her observation. "I do not think I have ever put a name to it," he said. "I only know that when I am out on the range late in the evening and the light comes that way, I am not inclined to move very fast." Florence looked at him, and he was still looking at the sky, and she thought that a man who slowed down for the quality of evening light was a more interesting man than most she had encountered. She went home with Widow Alderman an hour later, and if she lay awake somewhat longer than usual that night, she attributed it to the cider and the stimulation of company after a solitary week. The friendship, if that was what it was, grew in the way of things that have good soil. Unhurried, without drama, reaching toward the light by degrees. John Crawford came to town every Thursday, and it became a thing, not arranged but simply arrived at through repetition, that Florence would sometimes encounter him on the street, and they would walk together in the same direction for whatever portion of it they shared. They talked about the things that immediate life offered as subjects, the progress of the children, the weather and what it meant for the wheat crop, the news from the county seat, the peculiarities of Abilene's social landscape. They talked about larger things too, books they had read, the war and what it had unmade, the particular loneliness that could exist in the middle of a great deal of human activity. Florence was careful. She had been raised to be careful in the particular way that a woman in 1872 needed to be careful, which was to say that she was aware always of how things appeared. A schoolteacher's reputation was her livelihood, and her livelihood was her independence, and her independence was the only thing standing between her and a situation in which someone else made every decision for her life. She did not intend to behave carelessly. She walked with John Crawford in the open, in the main street, where everyone could see, and she spoke to him with the pleasant friendliness that she extended to all the parents of her students and the members of the community who supported the school. She told herself this was all it was. She told herself this right up until the November evening when a sudden storm rolled in off the plains while she was walking home from the schoolhouse, the kind that arrived with no warning and turned the air into something between rain and ice within 30 seconds. She ran for the nearest shelter, which happened to be the open doorway of the building she had watched going up piece by piece at the edge of the commercial district. It was far enough along by now to have a roof and walls, though the interior was full of sawdust and stacked lumber and the smell of new wood. John Crawford was inside, nailing something to a beam with steady, unhurried strokes, and he looked up when she stumbled in from the storm without any apparent surprise, as though women running in out of ice storms was a reasonable feature of his afternoon. "Miss Wells," he said, setting down the hammer. "Are you hurt?" "Only embarrassed," she said, catching her breath. "I did not see it coming." "Nobody does with a plain storm," he said, and moved to the doorway to look at the sky. The wind was considerable now, sheeting rain mixed with something harder across the empty lot. "It will pass within the hour. You are welcome to wait it out here." Florence looked at the interior of the building, at the careful construction of it, the way the beams were fitted and the floor was taking shape. "What is this going to be?" she asked. He hesitated for just a moment, which she noticed but did not know what to do with. "A general store," he said, "and some adjoining rooms. I have been building it evenings and weekends since August." "You built this yourself?" "Mostly. Tom Hatcher helped with the heavy beams." He was looking at the floor now, not at her. "Abilene needs another supply point on this end of town. The dry goods store is too far if you live out to the east." Florence walked slowly through the interior, running her fingers along one of the finished walls, feeling the smoothness of the sanded wood. Everything was built to last, as she had thought when she watched it going up. Nothing decorative, nothing approximate. Every joint was fitted, every edge was true. "You are very particular," she said, meaning it as a compliment. He looked at her then. "When something is worth doing, it is worth doing right," he said. And it was such a simple thing to say, but the way he said it made Florence feel that he was talking about more than construction. They sat out the storm in that half-built store, on stacks of lumber with the drumming of rain on the new roof above them, and they talked for 2 hours with the particular ease that a small enclosed space and a shared necessity can produce. He told her about Missouri, about the farm his father had run, and the way the war had changed everything in that state, neighbor against neighbor in ways that had not healed by the time he left. He told her he had come west because he had needed to be somewhere the ground itself had not been spoiled by what had happened on it. She told him about Cincinnati, about her father's brilliant and impractical mind, about the years of watching a man of great talent navigate the world with no practical sense of how to live in it, and how that had made her determined to be useful, to be competent, to never be dependent on something as unreliable as another person's management. "And yet you came west alone," he said. "That is not dependence," she said. "That is self-determination." He smiled at that, a full smile rather than the restrained one she more often saw, and Florence had to look away from it because something about it was more than she had prepared herself for. The storm passed. She walked home. She lay awake considerably longer than usual, and told herself absolutely nothing that night because some things are better not named until you are ready to hold them. November gave way to December, and December brought the particular hardship of a Kansas winter that Florence had not fully imagined from the relative softness of Cincinnati's cold. The plains wind was a different animal from city wind. It came across hundreds of miles of open country with nothing to slow it or soften it, and it arrived at Abilene with the accumulated force of all that distance. Florence wore every layer she owned to school and kept the pot-bellied stove burning at a furious rate, and still the children's breath showed in the schoolroom air some mornings. John Crawford stopped by the schoolhouse one Thursday in December with a cord of firewood stacked on his wagon. "The school board's requisition has been delayed," he said from the door, his hat in his hand, speaking to Florence without entering in a way that was respectful of every propriety. "I have extra wood from clearing the east field." It seemed wasteful to leave it. Florence looked at the wood, then at him. "How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," he said. "It is for the school. The school has a budget." "School's budget is delayed," he said calmly. "And the children are cold now. We can sort out the finances when the budget arrives." Florence studied him for a moment. He returned her gaze with the steady patience she had come to understand was simply his way, not indifference but a kind of settled certainty that the world would arrive at good sense eventually. "Thank you," she said. "Tell me where to have the school board send the payment." "Crawford property, 4 miles east on the Ellsworth Road," he said. "Though I would not hold your breath." She did not hold her breath, but she made certain the school board paid him because she was not willing to be in debt to anyone in any form, and she told him so the next Thursday when she saw him, and he looked faintly amused by her thoroughness. "You are very determined," he said. "I am very clear about obligations," she said. "There is a difference." "Tell me what it is." He considered. They were walking down the main street in the particular clear cold of a December afternoon, their breath visible between them. "A person who is determined about obligations is managing a ledger," he said. "A person who is simply determined is going somewhere." Florence thought about this. "Perhaps I am doing both." "Perhaps," he said. January brought a thaw that lasted 2 warm weeks and was followed by the most violent ice storm Florence had seen since arriving in Kansas, and it was during the ice storm that the schoolhouse roof came partially away from the eastern wall, where the new construction had not been secured properly. Florence discovered this at 7 in the morning, when she arrived to find a gap 2 feet wide letting in air cold enough to crystallize her eyelashes. She stood in the doorway of the damaged schoolhouse with her hands balled at her sides, and felt the specific despair of a person who has encountered a problem that exceeds what one person can manage. There were children due in 1 hour. She sent word with Tommy Whitfield's older brother to postpone school for the day, and then went directly to Harlan Greer at the dry goods store, who was extremely sympathetic and entirely useless, and then to the 2 other members of the school board, both of whom expressed deep concern and the opinion that a proper repair would require official authorization and a formal bid process that might take some weeks. Florence stood in the street after her third useless conversation and breathed the cold air and tried to think. She thought of John Crawford. She dismissed the thought immediately on the grounds that she had no claim on his assistance and no intention of making herself the kind of woman who ran to the nearest capable man every time something went wrong. She was not that woman. She had never been that woman. She walked to the hardware store, priced the materials required, discovered they exceeded her personal savings, walked back to the school board members, argued for emergency authorization, was told the chairman was at his farm and could not be reached until tomorrow, and at noon found herself standing outside the half-completed general store at the edge of the commercial district with the specific feeling of a woman who has exhausted every other option. The building was locked. A note on the door said J. Crawford back Thursday. This was Wednesday. Florence sat down on the step of the building in her heavy coat and allowed herself, for approximately 3 minutes, to feel the full weight of how impossible everything was. Then she stood up, dusted off her coat, and went back to the schoolhouse to see whether the damage was something she could temporarily address herself. It was not, but she tried anyway, which was perhaps the thing that defined her most essentially. John Crawford arrived at the schoolhouse at 4 that afternoon with a wagon, a length of lumber, and Tom Hatcher. He had heard from Tommy Whitfield's older brother, who had told the story to his father at the farrier's yard, where John Crawford had happened to stop that morning. He assessed the damage with the same quiet thoroughness he brought to everything, asked Florence 2 specific questions about the original construction, and then explained to her in plain terms exactly what needed to be done and roughly how long it would take. "The children should be able to return by Friday morning if this weather holds," he said. "I do not wish to be a burden," Florence said, meaning it. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something slightly impatient but not unkind. "Miss Wells," he said, "the children of this town deserve a school with a roof. That is not about being a burden to anyone. That is about what is right." She helped carry lumber until he told her she was more useful inside organizing the classroom materials away from the gap, which was a more tactful dismissal than she had expected, and which she accepted because she could see he was right. She made coffee on the small stove in the back corner and brought it out to him and Tom Hatcher at intervals, and when the light failed and they stopped for the evening, she stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse and told him what she had not said yet. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it properly this time, not as a formality." John Crawford looked at her from the wagon seat where he was coiling rope. The lantern light caught the side of his face and made shadows of the planes of it. "I know the difference," he said. She did not know what to do with that, so she nodded and went inside. By March, the general store was finished. John Crawford opened it on a Tuesday morning with no ceremony beyond unlocking the door, and by mid-morning it had done a brisk trade from the families on the eastern edge of town, who had been making the longer trip to Greer's dry goods store for 3 years. Florence went in that afternoon to purchase thread and found the interior just as carefully constructed as she had expected, organized with the same precise thoughtfulness that characterized everything the man did. He was behind the counter talking to a farmer about seed prices, and he acknowledged her presence with a brief nod that did not interrupt his conversation, which she found she respected enormously. She took her thread and left the correct money on the counter and went home. She thought about him that evening more directly than she had allowed herself to before, sitting by the window in Widow Alderman's kitchen with the spring wind just beginning to soften outside, and she acknowledged to herself, with the particular honesty she reserved for private moments, that she had never in her life met a man she trusted and admired and wanted to talk to, and was also distracted by in the particular physical way that the romance novels she had read in Cincinnati had tried to describe but never quite managed to convey with accuracy. She acknowledged this, and then she thought about what it meant and what she intended to do about it. She decided to do nothing. She had her school. She had her independence. She had $30 a month and a room with a lavender garden outside the window and a life that was entirely her own for the first time she could remember. She was not going to be foolish. This resolution lasted until April, when John Crawford came to the schoolhouse on a Thursday afternoon with a book. It was a volume of natural history, well worn, the spine repaired with careful stitching, the pages annotated in pencil in small, precise handwriting. He handed it to her without preamble and said that he had noticed she was teaching the older children about the plains ecosystem, and that this book had a section on the prairie grasses and native wildlife of Kansas that was more accurate than anything in the school's current texts. Florence took the book. Their fingers did not touch in the transfer of it because she was careful about such things, but she was aware of the proximity of his hand. "Thank you," she said. "It is a loan," he said. "Return it when you are done." She looked at him. He was looking at the book in her hands rather than at her face. "John," she said. He looked up. She had not used his first name before. She was not certain she had intended to use it now, but it was out, and she could not call it back. "Florence," he said, in a voice that was very quiet, and something in the quality of it rearranged the air in the room. Then 2 of the older girls came in through the side door arguing about something, and the moment broke apart, and Florence looked at the book in her hands and said she would return it in 2 weeks, and John Crawford said that was fine and left. She did not sleep at all that night. Spring moved into summer with the prairie's particular intensity. Heat arriving on the plains like something personal, the grasses going to gold, the sky turning a flat white blue at midday that Florence had learned to love as much as the evening colors she had tried to describe in October. She taught until the end of June, when the school term ended, and then she had 6 weeks that were hers to fill. She helped Widow Alderman with the kitchen garden. She read every book in the small lending library that the Methodist Church maintained. She revised her lesson plans for the autumn and improved every one. She returned John Crawford's natural history book in July, and he asked her whether it had been useful, and she told him every specific way it had been useful, and he listened with the particular attention she had come to understand was one of his essential qualities. The way he made you feel that what you were saying was the most important information currently available. They were standing in the general store, mid-morning, 2 other customers further down the shelves, and they talked for 20 minutes about prairie ecology and what Thomas Whitfield had made of the illustrations, and then John Crawford asked her if she would like to see the wild sunflowers on the ridge east of his property. It was such a direct and simple invitation that Florence almost did not know what to do with it. "That would require a horse," she said. "I have horses. I would need a chaperone." He was quiet for a moment. "I understand," he said. "Widow Alderman might come," Florence said, and was surprised by her own voice. He looked at her with those steady dark eyes. "Then I will bring an extra horse," he said. Widow Alderman came. She was 63 years old, entirely sharp-minded, and tremendously pleased with herself for reasons that she confined to an expression of benign innocence for the entirety of the excursion. They rode east from Abilene on a Saturday morning in late July, the 3 of them, and the sunflowers on the ridge were exactly what John Crawford had promised, which was a hillside covered wall-to-wall in tall golden flowers with their faces turned unanimously east like an audience waiting for something. Florence stopped her horse at the top of the ridge and looked at it and felt something so large and simple that she had no name for it in any language she had been taught. "I did not think anything would still surprise me," she said. "I have been surprised regularly since I came west." "Kansas has a talent for it," John Crawford said beside her, looking at the same hillside. Widow Alderman, behind them, said she thought she would walk along the lower path for a while and admire the view from that angle, and Florence heard the barely suppressed satisfaction in her voice and chose to address none of it. They were alone on the ridge for 20 minutes, and they stood side by side and looked at the flowers, and Florence thought that this was the sort of moment that happened in poems and not in real life, and then thought that she might have been wrong about that. "I think Abilene is home now," she said. "I did not expect to think that so soon." John Crawford said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I am glad of it." Not in the polite way. In the direct way he had that left no ambiguity about meaning. Florence looked at him. He was looking at the flowers. His hat was in his hands and the wind moved his hair, and she thought he was one of the most genuine human beings she had ever encountered, which was not a thing she had expected to think about a Kansas rancher, but which was undeniably true. She wanted to say something. She did not know what. She had spent a year being careful, and she was not certain she remembered how to be anything else. "John," she started. "I know," he said very quietly, and she was not certain what he knew, but she believed that he did. Widow Alderman came back along the path before anything further was said, commenting loudly on the beauty of the lower field and the excellence of the wildflowers in general, and they rode home to Abilene in the long golden afternoon, and Florence sat in her room that night and pressed her palms flat on her knees and breathed. August was dry and full of work for everyone. John Crawford managed the store and the ranch simultaneously in the way of a man who had built 2 things and intended both to survive. Florence helped organize the Harvest Social Committee at the request of the Methodist ladies, who had apparently decided she was a permanent enough resident to be given responsibilities. She attended meetings and made decisions and felt, gradually and inexorably, like a person who belonged somewhere. She went to the general store for supplies on a Tuesday in the last week of August, intending to purchase ink and a new slate pencil and a bolt of dark blue thread. The store was empty of customers when she arrived. John Crawford was behind the counter, bent over some papers, writing with the focused attention of a man who does not like to be interrupted. And Florence was about to announce herself politely when she saw the documents spread on the counter. She recognized the format of them because her father's estate papers had been a variant of the same thing, formal legal documents from the county recorder's office. She was not trying to read them. She was reaching past them for the bolt of thread on the near shelf. But her eye landed on her own name in the middle of the page, written in John Crawford's careful, precise handwriting. Florence Augusta Wells. She stopped breathing. She read 3 more words before she pulled her eyes away. The document was a property deed, a legal deed of title to the Crawford property 4 miles east on the Ellsworth Road, and her name was written into it. Not as a historical reference, not as a witness signature. She saw enough in those 3 seconds of accidental reading to understand that her name had been written into that deed as a co-owner of the property, with John Crawford's name beside it, both of them listed in the formal language of territorial land law as joint holders of the land. John Crawford looked up. He saw her face. He saw what she had seen. Everything stopped. The afternoon light was coming through the western window at a low angle, amber and full of dust motes, and Florence was standing with her hand still extended toward the thread shelf and her heart doing something entirely unprecedented in her chest. John Crawford did not move. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, and it was not guilt and it was not calculation. It was the expression of a man who has been found out in the act of loving someone very quietly and for a long time. Florence lowered her hand. She picked up the bolt of blue thread. She set her coins on the counter, counted exactly right. She took the thread and the ink and the slate pencil. "Good afternoon," she said, and her voice was steady. "Florence," he said. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. She did not turn around. She stood there for 5 full seconds, feeling the weight of what she had just seen and what it meant, and what it said about a man who had written her name into the ownership of everything he had built before he had ever asked her a single thing. She did not ask him to explain. Not then. Not ever. She walked home to Widow Alderman's with her thread and her ink and a feeling in her chest like something that had been wound tight for years and years finally beginning, slowly, to release its tension. She sat in the kitchen garden that evening until the sky went through every color she had learned to love since coming west, orange and gold, and that particular shade that was neither blue nor purple but both. And she thought about a man who had built a store and a ranch and a life with his own hands, and had written her name into the most permanent thing he owned while she was still deciding whether she knew her own mind. She knew her own mind. She had known it on the Sunflower Ridge in July. She had known it in the half-built store during the ice storm in January. She had known it, she thought, somewhere in the first conversation, in the middle of the street with her carpet bag, when he told her about the blue shutter without asking what had brought her there, or why she was alone. She went to sleep knowing that tomorrow was Thursday. John Crawford came to town on Thursday morning with the same unhurried regularity he always had. He was in the general store when Florence walked through the door at 10 in the morning, the same time she had always come on Thursdays when she needed supplies. He looked up from the counter. His face gave nothing away. Hers, she hoped, gave nothing away either. She had spent yesterday evening in precise, deliberate preparation for this moment. She walked to the counter and set down a piece of paper. It was a note in her handwriting, folded once. She placed it on the counter and kept her hand on it for one moment looking at him, and then she slid it across and let it go. He picked it up. He unfolded it. He read what she had written. He read it twice. She watched him. The note said, "I have nothing that belongs on a land deed yet. But I would like to, if you are asking." John Crawford looked up from the paper, and Florence felt the whole of the past year rearrange itself into a shape she could finally see properly, Every Thursday and every conversation and every evening she had told herself she was being careful, and every moment she had known, underneath the carefulness, that she was simply waiting until she was brave enough. "I have been asking," he said. "I did not know how to ask directly." "You wrote it in the deed," she said. "I did." "Before you ever asked me anything at all," she said. "I did," he said again. He was looking at her with complete honesty, nothing held back. "Because I knew the answer I wanted, and I wanted to believe it was possible, and the deed was the most real thing I could think of. The most permanent. I wanted it to be real somewhere, even if you never saw it, even if you said no." Florence stood at the counter of the general store in Abilene, Kansas, in September of 1872, and she looked at this man who had built everything with his own hands, and loved her quietly and completely before she had given him a single reason to believe she would say yes, and she felt something so large and true that there was no other response available except the honest one. "I am not saying no," she said. She did not need to ask him to explain. She had understood from the moment she saw her name in the ink, understood everything, the months of patience and the deliberate restraint and the quiet accumulated evidence of a man who showed what he felt through the things he built and the decisions he made rather than the things he said. She had understood it all, and she had not asked him to explain it, because some things are complete without explanation, the way certain skies do not need to be named to be beautiful. He came around the counter. He was not a man who moved hastily, but the space between them closed in a way that felt entirely inevitable, and when he took her hand, his was warm and solid and real, and Florence thought that she had been right about the quality of his attention, because the way he looked at her now was exactly like the way he looked at everything that mattered to him completely, without reservation, as though he intended to know it for the rest of his life. They were not entirely alone in the store. Mrs. Hatcher was somewhere in the dry goods section, and young Danny Greer had come in for a penny candy at some point and was now standing near the entrance with his mouth open. Florence was aware of both of these things and found that she did not particularly care. "I would like to do this properly," John Crawford said, still holding her hand. "Will you allow me to do this properly?" "I am already here," she said. "I walked here on purpose." He smiled, the full one, and it did to her now exactly what it had done in October when she looked away from it. She did not look away this time. He called on Widow Alderman that evening formally, in the established tradition, not because Florence required permission, but because it was the right gesture of respect for the woman who had housed and befriended her. And Widow Alderman received him in her parlor with poorly concealed delight, and offered him tea, and told him in considerable detail that she had known since October that this was inevitable, which Florence heard from the hallway where she was allegedly getting the cups, and allowed herself a small private smile. The official proposal came on a Saturday in the second week of September, in the afternoon, on the ridge where the sunflowers were now fading to bronze, and the autumn was beginning its complicated business of dying beautifully. John Crawford got down on one knee in the dried grass with a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small pearl, and he said things that Florence would keep in her memory for the rest of her life. Not grand speeches, but true ones, about the kind of life he hoped to build, and the kind of person he hoped to build it with, and the particular conviction he had, developed over months of Thursdays and every conversation in between, that Florence Wells was the most honest and capable and interesting and completely maddening person he had ever met, and that he would spend whatever time he was given making certain she never regretted saying yes. Florence said yes before he had quite finished the sentence, and he laughed, genuinely, low and warm, and put the ring on her finger and stood up and kissed her for the first time with the wind coming across the Kansas prairie and the bronze sunflowers nodding behind them. They were married in October, at the Methodist Church, on a day of extraordinary clear autumn light that painted everything gold. The church was filled to comfortable capacity, which surprised Florence, because she had not fully apprehended how many people in Abilene had apparently been waiting for this specific thing to happen. Widow Alderman was in the front row with a handkerchief she required before the vows were even finished. Thomas Whitfield, who was not technically a family member, had nonetheless managed to obtain a seat and was drawing something in the margins of his program, which Florence saw and felt was entirely appropriate. Harlan Greer gave a brief speech at the reception in the church hall that was genuinely gracious and only slightly marred by his wife Edith's expression of calculated social assessment. The ranchers and farmers who had known John Crawford for 3 years shook his hand with a warmth that told Florence how well he was regarded, not with loud enthusiasm, but with the solid approval of men who took character seriously. The children of her school left a card on the schoolteacher's desk the following Monday with all 12 signatures, and a drawing by Thomas Whitfield of 2 people standing on a hill covered in flowers, which Florence framed and hung in the schoolhouse and kept for the rest of her teaching life. Florence moved her things from Widow Alderman's room to the Crawford property 4 miles east on the Ellsworth Road. She had expected the farmhouse to be austere, and it was spare, but it was not austere. It was precise and comfortable in the way of everything John Crawford built, with a kitchen large enough to work in properly, windows that caught the morning light, and a bedroom with a view of the eastern fields where, in summer, the wheat moved in long golden waves that were one of the most purely beautiful things Florence had ever seen. She set her mother's Bible on the windowsill in a new room, and it looked, she thought, as though it had always been meant to be there. She kept teaching. This was not a discussion she had expected to need to have, and in fact it was not a discussion at all. John Crawford had never once suggested that marriage and teaching were incompatible. She returned to the schoolhouse the Monday after the wedding, and Thomas Whitfield grinned at her from his seat in a way that indicated he was pleased with the general situation, and she taught with the same focus and the same determination she had always had, and went home in the evenings to a life that was both larger and more specific than anything she had imagined when she stepped off that wagon in Abilene with $14.60. The first months of their marriage were both practical and deeply good. Florence was not a woman who confused romance with reality, and she had known that building a life together was different from the particular ache of wanting one. What she had not fully anticipated was how much she would enjoy it. John Crawford, it turned out, was good company in all of the daily ways that mattered, which were different from the ways that were visible at harvest socials and in doorways during ice storms. He was quiet in the mornings, and she respected that. She was sharp-tongued when she was tired, and he was unbothered by it. He made very good coffee. She made very good bread. He was funny in the dry, oblique way she had noticed from the beginning, and the domestic setting removed whatever had previously muted it, and she found herself laughing more in those first months than she could remember laughing in the preceding 10 years. They talked every evening. This was perhaps the thing she valued most, the way their daily conversations expanded into the evening, the way bread expands in warmth, taking on more dimension. He told her things she had not known, about the early years in Kansas, the settlers who had not made it, the bad winter of 1870 that had taken several families' entire livestock herds. She told him things she had not told anyone, about her father, not just the practical difficulties of his unworldliness, but the real grief of loving a brilliant man who could not protect you. He listened, and she knew by now that when he listened, he was truly present and not simply waiting for his turn, and this was rarer than it should have been. The property deed was updated formally in November by the county recorder's office. Florence signed her name beside John Crawford's in the official ledger with the same careful penmanship she had always used, and the county clerk looked up when she finished and said, "Mrs. Crawford, I believe your name was already noted in the private draft of this deed." "I know," Florence said, and signed clearly. The clerk looked faintly puzzled. John Crawford, who was standing to her right, said nothing and looked at the wall with a serenity that Florence knew by now was how he looked when he was trying not to smile. December passed with the particular ferocity of a Kansas winter, and the particular warmth of their first Christmas in the farmhouse. Florence decorated with pine branches from the creek line and made a pudding that did not turn out quite right, and John Crawford ate 3 servings of it anyway, with an expression of genuine appreciation that may or may not have been entirely truthful. They gave each other practical things because they were practical people, but John Crawford also gave her a set of books he had ordered from a printer in St. Louis, a complete collection of natural history texts, and Florence gave him a new pair of work gloves she had embroidered at the inside of the cuff with a small sunflower, which he found after he had already worn them twice, and looked at her with an expression that said everything without saying anything. Spring came back to the plains the way it always did, with a conviction that the world had been dark long enough, and now it was going to be extravagant about recovering. The wheat went in. The school opened its new term. Florence noticed in March that she was expecting a child, which she had suspected for 3 weeks and confirmed with the certain knowledge of her own body before she told anyone. She told John Crawford on a Thursday evening in the kitchen, matter-of-factly, the way she did things, because she was not a woman who arranged dramatic moments for information that was already complete. She said, "I believe we are going to need to consider the room at the end of the hall." He had been mending a leather strap at the table. He looked up. She watched him understand what she meant, watched it move through him, and then he set down the strap and came to her and held her very carefully, the way you hold something you are afraid of diminishing by holding too hard. "Florence," he said into her hair. "I know," she said, using his own words back at him. He laughed quietly and held her tighter. She was not particularly difficult in the pregnancy, which she attributed to stubbornness, and which John Crawford attributed to her general constitution without contradiction. She taught until late May, when the final weeks made the walk and the sustained standing genuinely difficult, and then she handed the schoolroom to a temporary teacher from the county for the summer with detailed written instructions that the woman later said were the most thorough instructions she had ever received from anyone in any context. Their son was born in August of 1873, which meant he arrived into the world with the sunflowers on the ridge in full gold bloom outside the window and the plain sky doing its most extravagant performance, and Florence lay in the large bed in the farmhouse room and held the small warm weight of him, and felt a love so total and immediate that it seemed impossible it had not existed 3 hours earlier. John Crawford sat in the chair beside the bed with his elbows on his knees, and his head bent over the infant in Florence's arms with an expression Florence had not seen before, and she thought that, for all the things she had noticed about this man in all the months and years of knowing him, this was the version of him she loved most entirely, the one that was also new, that had no practiced response to offer because it was encountering something so large that being practiced was beside the point. They named him William Thomas Crawford, William for no one specific, because they had decided it should be a name that was only his. Thomas because Florence wanted to honor the quality of seeing that Thomas Whitfield had, which she had been thinking about since her very first week in Abilene. William Thomas Crawford was a calm and curious infant who became a calm and curious boy who had his father's steadiness and his mother's sharp attention, and what appeared to be his own particular interest in the question of how things were constructed, both physical things and the things between people. By the time he was 2, he followed John Crawford around the ranch with the focused intensity of someone taking notes, and John Crawford narrated his work with the same patient thoroughness he brought to everything, explaining the purpose of each thing as he did it in the matter-of-fact way of a man who thought knowledge was worth sharing. Florence returned to the schoolhouse in September of 1873, with the temporary teacher looking relieved to hand the room back, and she walked in the first morning and looked at the 12 children in their seats, and felt the same thing she had felt on the first morning 3 years earlier, which was a settled righteous conviction that this work was exactly where she was supposed to be. The school board, which had gained 2 new members with rather more organizational competence than their predecessors, had approved a budget for the schoolhouse expansion and the acquisition of proper books, which Florence had advocated for with the specific tenacity of a woman who knows exactly what she is asking for and why. Thomas Whitfield was 14 now, in his last year of formal schooling, and Florence spent considerable time that year ensuring that his drawing skill was documented and understood as a genuine and serious aptitude. She wrote a letter to an art teacher in Kansas City, at John Crawford's practical suggestion, describing Thomas's talent and asking what the possibilities for further study might be. The letter came back with information and an encouragement that Florence delivered to Thomas's father at the farrier's yard, sitting on the fence rail in her schoolteacher manner, and explaining in complete detail why his son should be sent to Kansas City for art instruction rather than be apprenticed to the anvil. It took 3 conversations and the eventual testimony of John Crawford, who confirmed that Thomas's drawing of his horse had been more accurate than a photograph, but the farrier was persuaded. Thomas Whitfield went to Kansas City in the spring of 1875 and came back 3 years later an artist of developing reputation, who sent Florence a watercolor of the Sunflower Ridge every anniversary of his departure, for the rest of his life. The years that followed were not without difficulty. The winter of 1874 was severe even by plain standards, and the wheat crop suffered badly, and there were months of careful management of the property's finances that required both of them to be at their best simultaneously. John Crawford was, in those months, exactly the kind of man Florence had believed he was, not reckless and not defeated, working the problem with the same methodical patience he applied to fence wire and construction beams. Florence managed the store's accounts during the period when he was occupied with the land, discovering in herself an aptitude for commercial arithmetic that she had not previously had occasion to develop. They got through it. The spring wheat came back strong in 1875, and the store had built enough goodwill with its Eastern District customers to survive the lean months. Their daughter was born in the summer of 1875. She arrived 2 weeks earlier than expected and with considerably more urgency than William Thomas had managed, and John Crawford, who had the particular composure of a man who has handled difficult births with livestock, was significantly less composed about his daughter's arrival than he had been about anything in Florence's memory, which she found both touching and gently amusing. They named her Clara Jane Crawford. She had dark hair and her father's eyes, and her mother's terrifying efficiency of purpose from approximately the age of 4 months. William Thomas, 2 years old, received Clara Jane with the caution of a small person confronting something new and potentially competitive, followed by the gradual transition to protective approval that Florence watched with enormous pleasure. By the time Clara Jane was 6 months old, William Thomas had appointed himself her primary guardian and tour guide of the physical world, a role he held with great seriousness for the entirety of his childhood. Florence's life in those years had a quality that she sometimes sat with deliberately in the evenings, counting it, because she was enough of her father's daughter to know that good things should be examined and valued while they were present, and not only after they were gone. She taught children who grew and changed and went out into the world carrying things she had given them. She came home to a house that was full and warm. She had a husband who was, she had decided some time ago, probably the best person she had ever known, which was not a sentiment she would have expressed in those words to anyone except perhaps Widow Alderman, but which she knew to be entirely true. Widow Alderman died in the spring of 1876, quietly, in her sleep, which was the kind of death Florence thought she would have chosen for herself if asked. Florence sat in the lavender garden that had been outside her first window in Abilene for an hour before she let anyone know she was home, and she thought about every kindness the woman had extended without calling it kindness, just as she had never called her blue shutter anything except decorative, never mentioned that she kept a room available for women who needed a place that was safe and proper and affordable. She was buried in the Methodist churchyard, and Florence spoke at the service, and she said exactly what she believed, which was that some people make the world navigable for others without anyone ever being fully aware of the scope of the service. The schoolhouse was expanded in 1876 with a second room and a second teacher, a young woman named Marion Price who came from Ohio with good credentials and a determined expression. Florence was 30 years old now and had been teaching for 4 years in Abilene, and she took Marion Price under her professional confidence in the same spirit that she had always approached things that were worth doing right. Marion Price turned out to be excellent, which was a source of satisfaction on both sides. The county recorder's office sent an updated property deed in October of 1876. Florence received it, read it with the same precise attention she gave all documents, and found, as she expected, both names listed clearly and correctly in the permanent record of the land. John Crawford and Florence Augusta Wells Crawford, joint holders, as they had been since the day the county clerk had noted with mild puzzlement that her name was already in the private draft. She kept the deed in the drawer of the desk in the parlor, in a folder with the other important papers, alongside the marriage record and the birth records of William Thomas and Clara Jane. She had looked at it perhaps twice in the intervening years, not because she needed to confirm anything, but because she found, occasionally, that it was useful to look at the most permanent version of a thing in order to appreciate the full truth of it. She had never asked him to explain, and she never would. She understood it entirely, in the way you understand the most important things, not through explanation, but through the accumulated weight of everything surrounding it. He had written her name in the deed before she had said yes because he was a man who knew his own mind about things that mattered, and who built what he intended to last, and who had no practice in the kind of half-measures that would have been required to keep his hopes invisible. He had written her name in the deed because she was already real to him in the most lasting way, and the deed was the most permanent thing he owned, and he had wanted her real there too. She understood it the way she understood the evening sky over Kansas, not because anyone had explained the physics of color and light, but because she had stood in it long enough to know it by heart. In 1877, the Abilene School Board offered Florence the position of head of the county school district, a newly created administrative role that would require her to oversee the schools in 3 additional towns as well as the Abilene schoolhouse. It was a significant expansion of responsibility and a recognition of everything she had built in 5 years. She brought the offer home and discussed it with John Crawford over dinner, and he listened to the full description of the role and the attendant complications and then asked her one question, which was, "Do you want it?" "Yes," she said. "I am afraid I want it rather badly." "Then take it," he said. "It will require travel some weeks," she said, "to the other schools." "The wagon is reliable," he said, "and William Thomas is old enough to be useful for a few extra hours." William Thomas, at the age of 4, was consulted on this point and expressed the opinion that he could handle most ranch tasks. He could not, in fact, handle most ranch tasks, but his conviction on the subject was so genuine that Florence wrote her acceptance letter to the school board that evening. She took the position and was good at it, as she had expected to be, because she was good at most things she decided to do, which was a characteristic she had stopped apologizing for somewhere around 1874. She traveled to the outlying schools by wagon or by borrowed horse, and assessed their needs with the same thorough attention she had brought to everything since the beginning, and she wrote reports for the county board that were specific, well-argued, and frequently successful in obtaining the resources they requested. Marion Price took over the Abilene schoolhouse with full authority, and Florence retained the affectionate oversight of a senior colleague and the more practical oversight of her district role. Thomas Whitfield's watercolor of the Sunflower Ridge hung in the schoolhouse entrance hallway, and Florence had added a small plaque beneath it that said, simply, "Look carefully. Everything is worth seeing." 1878 brought a third child, arrived in May, a boy they named Henry Joseph Crawford. Henry was not like either of his siblings in temperament. Where William Thomas was steady and Clara Jane was efficient, Henry was extravagant in all the ways available to a small person, loud and joyful and completely without caution. And Florence loved him with the specific delight you can allow yourself with a third child, when the terror of newness has been replaced by the seasoned appreciation of knowing that small people grow and change and become more themselves with every year. John Crawford, at 37, was a man fully settled in his life in the way that some people never manage to be. The ranch was prosperous. The store was a fixture of the community. He had been asked twice to serve on the county association's governing board and had declined twice, not because he was indifferent to community matters, but because he preferred to exert influence through the specific and useful ways, showing up when there was labor to be done, contributing to the Winter Relief Fund without announcement, being the man others called when something needed to be handled properly and without drama. Florence, watching him across 30 years of accumulated days, thought that he was still the most steady person she had ever been in a room with, and that this quality, which she had noticed in the first 5 minutes of their acquaintance, had not diminished under the pressures of life but had instead become more precisely itself, the way good metal becomes more defined under the right kind of treatment. She told him this once, on an evening in the summer of 1878, sitting on the porch of the farmhouse with Henry asleep on her lap and the other 2 children chasing fireflies in the yard and the prairie dark and enormous around them. "You are a very steady person," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You sound surprised." "I am not surprised," she said. "I have been depending on it for 6 years. I was simply noting it properly for the record." He reached over and took her hand in the dark, the way he did sometimes without preamble, and she did not say anything further because the record had been sufficiently noted. The years continued as years do, each one distinct and each one containing its particular gift and difficulty. The drought of 1880 was hard on everyone in Dickinson County, and the Crawford property managed it by virtue of careful planning, and the wheat variety John Crawford had shifted to in 1877, on the advice of an agricultural almanac that Florence had located in the lending library and left on his desk with a note that said, "This seems relevant to the southeast field." He had read it and changed the planting strategy within the week. They had never discussed whose idea it was, because it was simply a thing that had happened, and the results were what mattered. William Thomas was 9 in 1882, curious and methodical, helping with the store on Saturday mornings in the way that children help with things, which is to say with tremendous enthusiasm and approximately 40% effectiveness, which John Crawford corrected with quiet patience and zero irritation. Clara Jane, 7, had appointed herself the arbiter of fairness in all sibling disputes and conducted her adjudications with a severity that Florence privately found both alarming and deeply satisfying. Henry, 4, had discovered an attachment to the horses that bordered on professional, and could be found in the barn at hours that required his parents to institute a door latch. Florence ran the county school district with increasing effectiveness as the years passed, and the network of relationships she had built became something with genuine structural integrity. She had hired 3 teachers, 2 of whom were women, one of whom had come west under circumstances not entirely different from her own, and Florence had made certain that the arrangements were clear, and the pay was fair, and the expectations were explicit from the beginning. Marion Price married in 1883 and continued teaching, because Florence had made it clear to the school board that this was not a matter requiring their opinion, which was a conversation that had been somewhat uncomfortable, but had resolved in Florence's favor through the specific combination of her administrative authority and her well-developed ability to make an argument that left its opponents with nowhere reasonable to go. The deed to the Crawford property was updated again in 1884, when the county reformed its land registration system under new territorial requirements. Florence and John Crawford went together to the county recorder's office, which now occupied a proper brick building at the center of Abilene, rather than the wooden room it had been when Florence first arrived. They sat side by side at the long table and signed the updated document, both names clear, and the clerk, a young man who had not been born when Florence arrived in Abilene, processed it with bureaucratic efficiency and without comment. Outside the recorder's office, in the late September light of 1884, Florence took John Crawford's arm in the easy way that 12 years of marriage had made natural, and they walked down the main street of Abilene in an afternoon that was familiar and comfortable and still capable of surprising her with its quality of light. 12 years, she said. Approximately, he said. You are still not a man who makes an occasion of things. I make an occasion of things, he said. Name one. He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel in the quality of his silence that he was actually thinking rather than deflecting. The first time you laughed, he said, at the harvest social. I marked that as an occasion. Florence was quiet herself for a moment, taken off guard in the specific way that he could still do after 12 years, the direct thing arriving when she had not prepared her defenses against it. That was not an occasion, she said when she had her voice arranged properly. That was just a conversation. It was an occasion, he said. I went home that evening and thought about it for 2 hours. She looked at him. He was looking forward down the street with his characteristic equanimity. You have never told me that before, she said. You never asked. She stopped walking, which made him stop as well, and she looked at him on the main street of Abilene with the October light making everything amber and honest. And she thought that 12 years had not made anything less, not the particular attention he paid to everything she said, not the steadiness, not the way he looked at her when she was not expecting it, and she still had to make a deliberate effort to hold his gaze and not look away. She had not imagined, when she was 24 years old and standing in the street with a carpet bag, that this was the shape her life would take. She had imagined something smaller and more contained, something practical, something that got by. She had not imagined this. The Sunflower Ridge, the deed, the name in ink before she had said yes, the farmhouse with the morning light, the 3 children who were, each of them, fully themselves, the life that was both more practical and more extravagant than anything she had planned. I would like to go see the sunflowers, she said. It was September. The sunflowers would be going to bronze at this hour, the full gold of August already fading. They are past their best, John Crawford said, but it was not an objection. I know, she said. I should like to see them anyway. He brought the wagon around. They rode east on the Ellsworth Road, past the farmhouse where William Thomas and Clara Jane were in charge of supper, and Henry was almost certainly not in the barn, past the wheat fields that were cut and golden stubbled in the autumn, past the creek line where the cottonwoods had gone yellow. The ridge was exactly as Florence had thought it would be, the sunflowers turning, not gone but in transition, the gold deepening to copper and amber at the edges where the season was finishing the business of being beautiful about it. She stood at the top of the ridge where she had stood 12 years earlier with Widow Alderman's delighted supervision and looked at the hillside, and the evening sky above it was doing its particular thing, the thing she had tried to describe to John Crawford on the first night they had really talked, the color that was neither blue nor purple but both. He stood beside her, and after a moment he said, "What do you call it?" "The color," she thought. 12 years of looking at it and she still did not have the word. "Home," she said. He did not say anything, which meant he understood completely. She took his hand. The prairie was enormous around them and the light was going, and the sunflowers moved in the evening wind with the same unanimity she had seen when they were in full gold bloom, all of them together, bending and rising, and Florence thought that this was the answer to the question she had been asking since she stepped off the wagon in 1872 with $14.60, and a mother's Bible and no plan except to be useful and to be free. She had found both. She had found both by the particular route of finding someone else, whose version of those things was large enough to contain hers without diminishing it. The farmhouse lights were visible from the ridge when the sky darkened enough, small and warm against the plain, and she would go back to it in a few minutes, back to the supper that William Thomas had probably half managed, and Clara Jane had entirely managed, and Henry had probably not helped with it all, and which would nevertheless be real and good and there. But for now she stood on the ridge with her hand in the hand of the man who had written her name in the deed before she said yes, and the sky went through every color she had learned to love, and the wind moved through the bronze sunflowers, and the night came in slowly from the east with all its stars, and Florence Wells Crawford, head of the county school district, owner of record of the Crawford property, mother of 3, wife and partner of the most genuine person she had ever known, breathed the Kansas air and felt the full weight of a life that had turned out, improbably and beautifully, to be exactly enough. In the years that came after, the ones that filled out the remainder of their long life together, there were many things that happened on the Crawford property and in the town of Abilene and in the wider world that pressed itself against the edges of their lives. The railroad changed Abilene's character gradually through the 1880s as the cattle trade shifted south, and the town remade itself from a drover stop into something more permanently settled, with brick buildings replacing wooden ones and a newspaper that covered county affairs with increasing ambition. Florence's school district expanded twice more, covering 5 schools by 1890, and she hired 7 teachers over those years and trained most of them personally in the specific philosophy of education she had developed, which centered on the conviction that every child possessed some quality of attention worth cultivating, and that the work of teaching was to find it and protect it. William Thomas Crawford grew into a young man of such evident competence and quiet character that people who did not know his parents said he had the look of someone who had been raised well, which was both a compliment and a significant understatement. He took over the management of the ranch's wheat acreage at 16, with an aptitude that confirmed everything John Crawford had suspected about the boy's particular intelligence. Clara Jane, by 15, had decided she was going to be a doctor, which was not common and was not straightforward and was, Florence told her, entirely possible with sufficient determination and appropriate schooling. Florence began writing letters to women's medical colleges that very year, because that was how she did things. Henry, eternally exuberant, discovered a natural talent for commerce that made him a brilliant asset to the store from the moment he was tall enough to see over the counter, and he ran it with such infectious enthusiasm that customers came partly for the goods and partly to hear what Henry Crawford had to say about the news. John Crawford at 50 was a man who wore his years in the way of the plains themselves, marked but not diminished, the long work having made him more essentially himself rather than less. He moved with the same unhurried ease that Florence had noticed in 1872, though there was gray now at his temples, and his hands carried the permanent evidence of everything he had built with them. He still came in from the evening field sometimes with the same slowed pace she remembered from those early stories, not inclined to move fast when the light was doing its thing over the prairie, and Florence, seeing it, would stop whatever she was occupied with and look at it too, because he had taught her, without ever making a lesson of it, that the world's beauty was worth the interruption. They sat on the porch most summer evenings when the day's work was done, the two of them and whatever children were home, and they talked in the easy circulating way of a family that has been talking to each other long enough to follow any thread from any starting point. Florence had a particular gift for the conversation that moved between the practical and the philosophical in the same breath, and John Crawford had a particular gift for the observation that stopped a conversation in its best moment, so that everyone in it had to pause and think. Henry married in 1895 a girl named Rosie from one of the outlying county towns, who had been the student of one of Florence's teachers, and was sharp and warm and entirely capable of keeping pace with Henry's particular energy. They lived in Abilene and ran the store with such combined effectiveness that John Crawford formally transferred ownership to them in 1897, with no grief and considerable satisfaction. William Thomas married in 1897 as well, a quiet young woman named Bate from a neighboring ranch, and they took over the day-to-day management of the Crawford property in the arrangement that John Crawford had been building toward for 2 years, the generational transfer of something he had built with the intention that it outlast him. Clara Jane Crawford, after a path that had required Florence's persistent correspondence and 3 different arrangements of study, qualified as a physician in 1899, one of a small but growing number of women who had completed medical training in the United States by that point. She set up practice in Abilene, in a room at the edge of the main street, and was initially regarded with the skepticism that was the routine experience of women in professional roles in 1899, and within 2 years was the most requested doctor in the county, which Florence received with the specific satisfaction of a woman who has been right about something for a long time. Florence herself retired from the school district in 1900 at 52, not because she was finished, but because she had built something that could continue without her, and she recognized that this was, in fact, the full completion of the work. She handed the district files to her successor with a comprehensive written transition document that her successor later said was the most useful thing she had ever been given, which Florence received as the intended compliment. She did not stop teaching. She helped Clara Jane with the paperwork of the medical practice, which was considerable, and which Clara Jane found less interesting than the medicine itself. She tutored several children in the county who were not being adequately served by the standard schooling. She corresponded extensively with teachers across Kansas and beyond, because she had opinions about education that the retirement of her official role did nothing to quiet. On the evening of their 30th anniversary, Florence and John Crawford rode out to the ridge. Their riding was somewhat slower now than it had been, the horses older and the riders not young, but the ridge was as it had always been, and the sunflowers in October were doing their bronze and copper thing, and the sky above the Kansas plain was doing its particular color, the one that was neither blue nor purple but both. They sat on the ridge for a long time without needing to say much, because 30 years of conversation had not exhausted the words between them, but had instead created a kind of fullness that did not require constant filling. The farmhouse lights were visible below them as they had always been when the sky went dark enough. The night came in from the east. The stars over Kansas were extravagant and close. "What do you call it?" Florence said, looking at the sky. He looked at her, knowing exactly what she meant, the same question she had never fully answered. "I call it exactly right," he said. Florence looked at the sky and then at the man beside her, and she thought that this was what she had not had a word for in the first moment she found her name in the deed. In that breathless instant in the general store, when the ink had not yet fully dried, and the whole of a life had rearranged itself into a shape she could finally see. She had a word for it now, had had the word for 30 years, had simply not needed to state it because some things are complete without explanation. The way the sky over Kansas does not need anyone to name its colors in order to be entirely beautiful. She took his hand. The stars were out. The sunflowers bent and rose in the wind below them. And somewhere in the house at the foot of the ridge, lit and warm and full of the evidence of everything they had made together, their children were going about their lives with the steady sureness of people who had been shown, every day of their growing up, what it looked like to love someone carefully and completely, and without reservation. Florence Wells Crawford pressed her husband's hand and felt the whole of it, the beginning and the middle and the good long ending, and found that there was not a single thing she would have changed.